Some stories begin under the flash of cameras, under applause in grand halls, or with a leader's bold declaration to the world. But some stories begin in silence, the kind of silence thick like the Sahel night, the kind of silence where just one uneven breath, one stray decision is enough to shift the fate of an entire nation. And this story opens with such a moment. That year, on the red desert of Burkina Faso, as the evening wind sank into the dunes, as a young man bowed his head to enter his prayer, the most sacred moment of a soldier's life, of any life right behind him, just an arm's length away, the destiny of the whole country was placed on another man's shoulders. A man who was not a general, not a minister, not anyone powerful in the government. He was simply the bodyguard standing behind Ibrahim Traoré. Just that. But sometimes it is exactly that just where history quietly turns. Because a few days before that sacred moment, when the late afternoon sun still glowed on the golden mud walls of Ouagadougou, an offer was delivered to that bodyguard, an offer that arrived without gunshots, without threats, without a single shadow forcing him. It came the same way all betrayals in African history have come, quietly, skillfully, elegantly, and from the last place anyone would expect. A ticket out of his homeland, a luxurious future guaranteed for his whole family, a foreign passport opening a door millions dream of, and above all, 5 million USD. Not ransom, not aid, but the price placed on a human life. The price placed on Ibrahim Traoré, one of the youngest, boldest, most closely watched leaders in modern Africa. All the bodyguard had to do was nod. Just one movement faster than a heartbeat. Just one simple tightening of a finger. And Burkina Faso would wake up in chaos. The world would exhale in relief because an obstacle had vanished. History would repeat itself once again. For the 1000th time, no one bothers counting anymore. Because from Lumumba to Sankara, from leaders who cried out for dignity to those who dared declare that Africa must stand on its own feet, most did not fall to foreign enemies, but to the hand standing beside them during the morning salutes, during the moments of silence, during shared breakfasts among comrades. That is why, when the bodyguard stepped into the shadows to meet the messenger who brought the offer, that moment was one where all of Africa, though completely unaware, stood on the edge of repeating its oldest tragedy. But what happened next did not follow the usual script of the past decades. It did not end like Sankara's blood-soaked finale. It did not replay the betrayal stabbed into Lumumba's back. It did not copy the painful chapter Africa has long grown numb to, because that man said no. And that refusal, a small, quiet no heavier than a declaration of war, is the heartbeat that begins the story we are about to enter. If you feel the weight of this moment, if you believe that some silent decisions can save a nation from repeating its tragedy, leave a comment and follow the channel so we can continue this journey together. There is a truth anyone who studies African history knows, but few dare to say out loud. The downfall of patriotic leaders rarely comes from beyond the border, not from foreign armies, not from famous intelligence agencies, not from armored convoys crushing through city streets. No, power in Africa is rarely defeated through direct force. It is worn down, hollowed out, stabbed from behind. A nation does not lose its leader because the enemy is stronger. It loses them when trust inside is broken. This has happened so many times, it has nearly become a repeating program, a template. Foreign powers only need one thing. Not an army, not negotiations, but a person standing in the right place. A door open at the right moment. A single second where the betrayer knows his leader is bowing his head, exhausted, unguarded. Seasoned intelligence services know very well they do not need to storm into the center of power to change history. They only need what African history, painfully, has always provided. Someone familiar, someone close, someone once welcomed into the circle of trust. No one understands this more deeply than countries scarred by bloody tragedies. Look at the decades behind us. Patrice Lumumba, who raised the banner of Congo's sovereignty, was not toppled by foreign soldiers knocking at the door. He was brought down by the very man he placed in a position to protect the nation, the man he believed would be the shield against external schemes. That position, that small distance of a few steps beside power, became the most lethal weapon. Thomas Sankara, the red flame of Burkina Faso, the man who ignited the spirit of self-reliance, freedom, and African pride, was not shot by distant forces. He was defeated by the footsteps of men who once stood in formation behind him, by the silence of those who once swore to dedicate their lives to the same ideals. It is a wound so deep that even today, many in Burkina Faso feel a sharp sting in the national memory every time his story is mentioned. All of this has formed a map of betrayal, a map so brutal that over time people stopped asking questions. And then a fear took hold, a fear that this law of betrayal would never end. That is why when the world heard about the plot against Ibrahim Traoré, the first question was not who was behind it. The first question was, who was standing behind him? For years, history has repeated one bitter message. Betrayal does not begin with gunshots. It begins with familiar footsteps, with the usual morning greeting, with a nod that hides danger instead of friendship. Betrayal does not come from the enemy. It comes from the one you have no reason to suspect. That is why the moment the bodyguard stepped into the darkness to hear the offer, decades of history pressed down on him. A test so many before him had failed, bills that weighed like stone, promises of a luxurious life abroad glittering like a mirage, and the feeling that with just one small action, his entire life could change and no one would ever know. But inside that darkness where the breath of history still lingered, something rare happened. The bodyguard understood he was not only refusing a sum of money, he was refusing to open a door that would push Burkina Faso into a tragedy the nation knows too well. He was refusing to join the long list of those who helped throw this continent into cycles of pain. He understood that sometimes loyalty is not only a personal choice, it is the final barrier against the waves of history trying to sweep an entire nation away. And this is only the first layer of the story. Because to truly understand the weight of that loyalty, we must look directly at the wounds of the past, the places where betrayal shattered the future of an entire people. History never repeats itself perfectly, but it leaves footprints. Those footprints lead us back through roads stained with blood, shattered dreams, and the weight of a continent forced to bow its head in grief for generations. And to understand why the bodyguard's refusal today carries such enormous meaning, we must walk back to where those first footprints began to weep. Burkina Faso once had a son named Thomas Sankara, a man who didn't just dream of the future, he dared to turn that dream into reality at a speed that stunned the world. Sankara lived like an arrow, fired straight ahead, without hesitation, without compromise, without fear. He believed so deeply in the dignity of the African people that many called him the face of a new Africa. But what people remember about him is not only that he lived by his ideals, it's that he died because of them. The final days of Sankara were not cinematic. There was no long chase, no foreign raid. His death came from the direction no one wanted to believe. From someone who had once broken bread with him, someone who had sat with him by the fire since childhood, someone he called by the most sacred name friendship can offer, brother. That man was Blaise Compaoré, and when he chose to close the last door that could have saved Sankara's life, the entire continent seemed to hold its breath, not because of the gunshot, but because the lesson was painfully clear. Trust is the most beautiful thing in politics, but placed in the wrong hands, it becomes the sharpest blade. Africa seemed ready to wake up after that tragedy. But history does not awaken after just one fall. It needs more pain before it learns its lesson. Patrice Lumumba was one of those pains. The young Prime Minister of Congo carried a flame in his voice no one could mistake. That flame shook empires. Lumumba feared no external pressure. What he failed to see was the embrace of the people standing at his side. Joseph Mobutu, the man Lumumba trusted, supported, and placed in a key position to protect Congo's fragile independence, became the first to open the door to disaster. He did not need to fire a shot. All he had to do was step aside, align with the right foreign hands, leave just enough space for betrayal written in distant capitals Congo could not see. When Lumumba was taken away on that final drive, many Congolese did not yet know their nation had just lost its most precious treasure. Not a leader, but a future that could have been different. And now when we look back at Sankara and Lumumba, we are not revisiting two lives. We are confronting a rule that has crushed countless African dreams, the rule that the outsider does not need to walk into the palace. He only needs one person inside to step half a pace back. This is why the bodyguard's role in the present feels so extraordinary. He stood where many had collapsed under temptation, where money once conquered loyalty, where promises of a foreign paradise had already become the blade stabbing this continent over and over again. But this time, the blade did not reach the flesh of history. This time, a man who has never been written about in books, never appeared in newspapers, never spoken before a crowd, became the line between the past and the future. Inside the silence of that seemingly small decision, there is the echo of Sankara, the resonance of Lumumba, the tears of nations betrayed by the very people they trusted most. And this is only the surface of the story. The next part takes us back to present-day Burkina Faso, where a new test awaited and where that loyalty changed the direction of an entire nation. When people look at the tragedies of Sankara and Lumumba, they often ask whether history can truly change, whether a continent wounded again and again from within can still find a new path, whether the silent betrayals that haunt the corridors of power can one day be replaced by real loyalty. These questions do not belong only to scholars or historians. They echo in every village of the Sahel, in every market of Ouagadougou, in every night when families gather around a radio to hear news from the capital. And the answer did not first appear from an international forum, nor from a grand declaration, but from a choice made by an ordinary man, the bodyguard who stands behind Ibrahim Traoré every day. The president of Burkina Faso is not easy. Everyone knows that. This nation stands at a crossroads where war, poverty, foreign interference, and the struggle for sovereignty intersect. One mistake can pull the country into chaos. One moment of weakness from the man standing beside the leader can open the ending history has already written too many times. But what is striking is that Burkina Faso is not bowing to that fate. Under the leadership of a young man barely in his 30s, the country is choosing its own road. A road that does not compromise, does not hide, does not shrink. And standing at the very center of that journey is the shadow of the unnamed bodyguard. In the noise of global politics, people often forget that power is not always protected by speeches. Sometimes it is protected by the man standing silently behind, by a pair of eyes watching every small detail, by a heart that understands that one trembling second could make everything collapse. That bodyguard lives within the space history calls the most dangerous distance, the half step behind a leader, the distance that, if shifted even slightly, can change the direction of an entire nation. In that space, many have fallen to temptation. In that space, many have chosen money. In that space, many believe they could buy the world's respect with dollars and foreign passports. But the man in this story is not one of them. He understands that loyalty is not something you give to someone else. It is a mirror of who you are. He understands that pulling a trigger is not just killing a person. It is killing every possibility his country is trying to build day by day. And he understands that only on the red soil of Burkina Faso does he never have to bow to anyone. After refusing, he did not run. He did not ask to be moved. He did not hide. He returned to his post, standing behind Traoré as if nothing had happened. But from that moment on, everyone knew something had shifted. Not in politics, not in the military, but in the consciousness of a nation. A story began to spread. From a military barracks, to a tea shop on a street corner, to the distant Sahel villages where the radio is still the most faithful companion, people whispered to each other that this time, things were different. This time, the man behind the leader did not open the door to betrayal. This time, history had been given a different voice. In every glance, every quiet conversation, there was a feeling Burkina Faso had not touched in a long time. A feeling that loyalty still exists. A feeling that opportunity is not always swallowed by ambition and money. A feeling that what their ancestors dreamed of can be protected not only with guns, but with dignity. And because of that, what is happening in Burkina Faso is not just the story of a single nation. It is a test for an entire continent, long pushed backward by betrayal from those closest to power. This story is far from over. Because to understand the true weight of this loyalty, we must look deeper into how that decision shattered a script many forces had prepared long before. When a major plot is destroyed, it rarely collapses with explosions or chaos. Most of the time it collapses in silence. The silence of a meeting refused. The silence of an offer left unanswered. The silence of the hidden hands that suddenly realized the key they had invested all their hopes in simply refuses to turn. The approach to the bodyguard did not come through familiar officials or recognizable power brokers. It came through faceless channels. Anonymous intermediaries, messengers with no names. That is how foreign forces operate, always making sure they never show enough of themselves to be held accountable. They approached him using the same formula they had used in many other nations. First came the test of silence, observing his routines, studying his moments of weakness, searching for the cracks every human being has. Then, step by step, they laid down the bricks of a fake escape route, a route meant to lead him away from the land where he stood. They spoke of faraway cities where he would live a life that locals struggled decades to reach. They spoke of safe apartments, good schools for his children, hospitals with every facility imaginable. They painted the image of a life without burdens, without threats, without waking every morning to protect a man carrying a nation on his shoulders. And then, once they knew he was listening, they revealed the final price. $5 million. A number crafted to be irresistible. A number heavy enough to crush men who once believed themselves unbreakable. A number meant to buy not just one life, but generations ahead. But there was one thing the architects of this plot did not understand. Poverty can shake a man, but dignity can withstand everything. And the dignity of this bodyguard was not measured in money. It was measured in the red soil of Burkina Faso. When the moment of decision arrived, he did not need long to think. He understood that a wealthy life in a distant land could never replace the humiliation of walking among eyes that no longer respected him. He understood that the real price of that money was not comfort, it was the loss of himself. The approach ended with a single sentence. But that sentence was enough to slice through the entire script foreign powers had prepared in the shadows. When the intermediary walked away, the bodyguard knew he had stepped into dangerous territory. Refusing does not make a plot disappear. It only changes form from temptation to pursuit, from seduction to threat, from offers to revenge. Yet instead of retreating to protect his own life, he chose to stay in the same place, half a step behind the young leader. The distance history calls the line between life and death. That courage shook the entire structure of the conspiracy. Because no plan, no matter how detailed, can ever calculate the power of loyalty. Those who designed this scheme, rooted deep for decades, always believed that African circles of power could be easily divided. That money could buy anything. That placing the right person in the right spot would guarantee the story they wanted. This time, they were wrong. Not just wrong, they underestimated something they never truly understood. Africans do not need much to stand firm. They only need one reason to be loyal. And the bodyguard found his reason the moment the intermediary laid the money on the table. When the story leaked from barracks to the streets, and then to the people, the plot did not simply fail. It was exposed. Reduced to another example that Burkina Faso is no longer the Burkina Faso of old. This is a country where old scripts no longer repeat themselves. And from that moment on, Burkina Faso stepped into a new chapter, a chapter where the loyalty of an unnamed man was enough to make distant powers hesitate, powers that once believed they could manipulate the destiny of a nation from across the ocean. After the bodyguard rejected the offer, the outside world stayed calm as if nothing had happened. No urgent news flashes, no investigative headlines, no police rushing in to make arrests. But beneath that silence, a tremor began to spread like ripples widening from a stone dropped into a perfectly still lake. The first thing that changed was not at the government headquarters, not in the military command rooms, but in the heart of the bodyguard himself. Once he spoke his refusal, he knew he was no longer the anonymous man he once was. Every step he took from that moment forward could throw his life and his family's life into danger. He knew the forces that had placed money on the table would not quietly accept defeat. He knew his loyalty had turned into an act of defiance. And yet, when the sun rose the next morning, he stood in the same position as always, half a step behind Ibrahim Traoré, in the narrow space where a single blink in the wrong direction could open the door to disaster. What he did forced those around him to look again. Not because he told the story. He kept silent. But that silence spread like a flame. His fellow soldiers began hearing scattered fragments. The story slipped through the military canteen, into the corners of meeting rooms, into late-night guard shifts where young soldiers whispered to each other, wondering why he had grown so quiet and thoughtful. From the silence of one man, the vigilance of the entire team rose. And then something unexpected happened. No orders were given, no instructions handed down. But each soldier began adjusting the way they stood watch, how they observed, how they defended their young leader. Not because of fear, but because of pride. Because for the first time they saw someone in their own ranks personally crush a plot that would have been written as another dark chapter of their history. Burkina Faso has always been a land of warriors. But now, there was something new, a belief that loyalty can still stand firm against the undercurrents coming from far beyond their borders. And from there, the bodyguard's story spread faster than a bullet. Not because anyone intended to spread it, but because it touched something deep inside the people, the belief that this time, their nation had not been sold out from within. Old men retold the story in roadside tea stalls. They said that in their lifetimes, it was rare to see someone who had the power to betray choose instead to stand firm. They spoke of Sankara with heavy voices. They spoke of Lumumba with distant eyes. And then they spoke of this bodyguard with quieter but brighter tones. And its influence in the region. For the first time in years, finally authorized a nuclear deal, believed the future might be different. In the Sahel, farmers heard the story through an old radio sitting on a wooden table. They fell silent at the detail that the moment chosen for the attack was during prayer. They understood the cruelty of that plan far more deeply than any analyst. Prayer is the one place where a person removes fear and bows only to the Almighty. To strike in that moment is not merely to kill a leader, it is to tear at the soul of a people. And the bodyguard stood between that soul and its destroyers. In the capital, the military understood better than anyone that his refusal was more than a moral gesture. It was a message that Burkina Faso's inner circle could no longer be purchased so easily, that foreign hands seeking to control the nation would have to think twice, that a plan that once seemed flawless could crumble into dust because one man stood firm in the moment of testing. Those behind the plot understood it too. They knew they had not only failed to eliminate a leader, they had failed to prove their long-standing belief that Africa could always be broken from within. One man had shattered that assumption. From here, the story is no longer about an offer. It is about a choice that changed the way Burkina Faso sees itself, and changed the way the world sees Burkina Faso. There are moments in history when people do not need an official announcement, a press conference, or a headline on the front page. They only need to feel it. Because sometimes, a great shift does not arrive with an explosion, but with a quiet tremor that spreads through every person, every home, every marketplace. The bodyguard's refusal created exactly that kind of tremor. A wave no one could see, yet everyone could sense. It began as whispers within the military, then flowed into the neighborhoods, and eventually seeped into everyday conversations like an underground current seeking its path beneath the earth. At first, the people of Burkina Faso were unsure whether to believe it. They had witnessed too many stories of betrayal gathering dust. They had heard too many tales of conspiracies only to watch their nation end up in the hands of those who were supposed to protect it. So when rumors of the bribe began spreading, they hesitated. It was only when soldiers, men who rarely show emotion, began quietly repeating what they had heard that the picture slowly came into focus. The story wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't a wild rumor. It wasn't a product of imagination. It was real, a truth strong enough to change the way Burkina Faso saw itself. People began asking each other, why was this time different? Why did the man refuse the money? What did he gain by rejecting a comfortable life across the ocean? Who would protect him if the forces behind the plot wanted revenge? But those very questions highlighted what mattered most. The bodyguard did not act for his own future. He acted for the future of a nation fighting to escape the chains that held it for decades. One afternoon, In the crowded market of Ouagadougou, an elderly woman stood in the center of a small gathering and said she had lived through the days of Sankara. She said she once saw hope crushed in a single afternoon because one person stood on the wrong side. Then she looked at the young people around her, smiled, and said that this time she saw something different. She saw a seed of hope she thought she would never witness again. In the northern Sahel, where small, quiet villages faced challenge after challenge, the story of the bodyguard also became a topic during nightly gatherings. Hunters returning home set down their gear and recounted every detail they had heard on the radio. Children listened with wide eyes, as if the story was not just a tale for adults, but the first moral lesson of their lives. In the capital, political analysts began asking broader questions about the meaning of this event. They argued that in a moment when Burkina Faso faces immense external pressure, an act of loyalty like this is not merely personal, it is structural, a sign that trust is returning after decades of erosion. And then something else happened. The outside world began watching Burkina Faso with more caution, not because they feared the nation becoming stronger, but because they realized the old formula for intervention was losing its power. A plot had been broken by a man they assumed was easy to buy. A plan calculated down to the second had shattered under a decision no one could predict. Across Africa, people looked at the story as if, looking into a mirror, they saw the shadows of past pain. But this time, instead of seeing repetition, they saw interruption. They saw a blade stopped before it could reach a leader's back. They saw history cut free from an old cycle. And that was the moment the people of Burkina Faso understood they were living in a special time. They were not only seeing their leader stand firm against a storm of conspiracies, they were seeing the man behind their leader stand firm as well. After so many years, for the first time, they realized sovereignty does not depend only on major decisions made at the national level. It also depends on quiet decisions made by ordinary people. And from that silence, a new chapter is beginning. When a story begins spreading across a nation, it stops being just a story. It becomes a reminder, a marker, a piece of collective memory carried by millions of people at once. The bodyguard's refusal was no longer an individual act. It became a symbol stepping out of the shadows, not with chants, not with slogans, but with the weight of a choice to stand firm where so many others had fallen. And that symbol opened something Burkina Faso had not experienced for decades. A movement within the national consciousness. An awakening born from something seemingly small, because sometimes a nation does not change through massive reforms, but through one moral action made at the right moment, in the right place, by the right person. In the days after the incident, Ibrahim Traoré continued to appear before the people as he always had. He still stood in the middle of crowds. He still traveled into regions many leaders avoided. But now, the eyes watching him carried something new. Not just respect for a young leader, not just the hope placed on a man trying to pull the country out of the swamps of history. They looked at him with deeper trust because they knew the man standing behind him had put his entire life on the line as a shield. From that trust, a shift spread throughout the country. Military units tightened their ranks. No one saw their work as a simple duty anymore. Every step, every shift, every meeting carried the sense that they were part of something larger. They understood that if one ordinary man could reject $5 million to protect the country, then they too had a responsibility to do their part. Inside the government, leaders began to see a new reality. Stability does not come only from weapons or policies. It comes from loyalty, from pride in standing with one's own nation. Because loyalty, when expressed at the crucial moment, is more powerful than any weapon ever forged. And so Burkina Faso, long accustomed to waves of political turbulence, began to find a new rhythm. A slower rhythm, a steadier rhythm, a deeper rhythm. A rhythm built on the collective understanding that the country can stand firm as long as the people closest to power still hold onto their dignity. But what surprised the world was not the internal unity. It was the transformation in the mindset of the people. They no longer looked toward the future with resigned acceptance. They began talking about autonomy, about dignity, about reclaiming their voice on the international stage. Many citizens said they felt as if Burkina Faso had finally stepped out of the long shadow of its past, no longer a land where foreign powers could act as they pleased, no longer a territory easy to manipulate. A man from Kaya said that for the first time in his life, he saw a light of pride in the eyes of the youth, not pride from victory, but from the moral strength of someone whose name they did not even know. Stories like these gradually formed a new wave, a wave political analysts began calling a rebirth of national spirit. No one ordered it. No one demanded it. It simply appeared because the people realized that a nation grows strong not only because of its leader, but because of the people standing behind the leader, people who refused to sell themselves. And then, as Burkina Faso continued facing external pressure, the difference became unmistakable. The forces that once felt confident they understood Africa's internal fractures began to grow cautious, because they realized this nation was entering a stage where old formulas no longer worked. Burkina Faso was no longer the country that could be toppled with a smooth promise and a suitcase of cash. No longer the country where a single person could open the door to disaster. This nation is rewriting the way it protects itself. And the new chapter began the moment the bodyguard said no. There are moments that do not need to be written into law, do not need to be read before parliament, do not need to be announced in grand ceremonies. They become a nation's declaration simply through the force of truth. And the truth Burkina Faso is experiencing now is this. A nation can be threatened by 1,000 forces from outside, but all those forces become powerless when loyalty inside is tightened. The bodyguard's refusal of the bribe was not just a victory of morality. It was a declaration no one wrote, yet everyone heard. A declaration that Burkina Faso has entered an era where its internal ranks are no longer the weakness others can exploit. In the weeks that followed, this shift began to reveal itself more clearly. In the military, discipline tightened, not through harsh commands, but through the pride of defending a leader the people respected. Young soldiers began to understand that their job was not only to hold a rifle, they were holding the fate of the country. Inside state institutions, meetings once heavy and dull took on a new tone. People spoke of external infiltration with sharper clarity, spoke of reform with greater resolve, spoke of the future as if crafting something sacred. Mid-level leaders who once felt distant from the center of power now understood they were living in a time when one righteous action could change the current of history. On the streets, citizens felt the shift in the simplest ways, not through political reports, not through speeches, but through smiles, through passing glances, through spontaneous remarks that this time the country was moving in the right direction. One evening in a small house outside Ouagadougou, a father told his son the story of the bodyguard. He told the boy that loyalty is not something lofty. It starts with knowing who you are and where you belong. The child listened and asked whether he too could one day protect the country like that bodyguard. The father stayed silent for a moment and replied that protecting the country is not just for people with guns, it is for anyone who chooses to stand on the side of what is right. Farther away, in regions where the Sahel sun burns the earth so fiercely that hope seems ready to evaporate, the story of that loyalty became a source of clear water. People felt that if someone with every opportunity to betray chose honesty, then they too could rise above their own exhaustion. And then the story moved beyond Burkina Faso. Neighboring nations began to talk. Analysts from Mali, Niger, Guinea looked at Burkina Faso with new eyes. They did not just see a country resisting outside pressure. They saw a country healing its internal wounds, something many African nations have never fully accomplished. Foreign news channels that once covered Burkina Faso with doubtful tones began shifting their questions. They no longer asked why Burkina Faso was unstable. They began asking how Burkina Faso was still standing. A small change, but proof that the narrative had left its old path. Meanwhile, the forces that once tried to interfere, that once spent money to buy influence, that once dreamed of manipulating Burkina Faso's politics as they had before, now faced a truth they could not deny. They did not just lose a plot. They lost to a rising moral strength. And from this point forward, Burkina Faso steps into a new phase where the value of loyalty is no longer treated as a luxury in politics. It becomes the measure of the future, a foundation stronger than any international agreement. There are moments in history, when the line between a single nation and an entire continent becomes so thin that every local story carries, meaning far beyond its borders. The story of the bodyguard standing behind Ibrahim Traoré, refusing $5 million, is no longer just the story of Burkina Faso. It feels like an arrow suddenly cutting through the heavy air of Africa, a continent that, for decades, has grown more familiar with betrayal than with loyalty. As the story spread, it opened a far larger question. A question every African generation has faced, yet rarely dared to confront directly. Can Africa rewrite its own destiny from within without waiting for someone else to rescue it, without searching for a perfect hero, without depending on promises from distant nations? This question is not abstract philosophy. It is present in every political crisis, every plot, every betrayal that has stained an entire century. And then something seemingly small challenged that question at its roots. One man, nameless, powerless, standing at the crossroads of betrayal or dignity, chose the harder path. From that choice, Africans began revisiting their deepest wounds. They remembered Lumumba, who did not fall to foreign soldiers, but to a hand within his own ranks. They remembered Sankara, who did not die from threats across the border, but from a gun fired by someone who once called him brother. And when they looked at Burkina Faso today, they saw something completely opposite. A single act of loyalty had stopped a script that history had written again and again. A small act of loyalty powerful enough to break the familiar mechanism of foreign interference. From Dakar to Bamako, from Niamey to Conakry, people began speaking about Burkina Faso with a feeling rarely found in recent decades. Not fear, not disappointment, but hope. A hope not based on the miracle of a leader. A hope placed instead in ordinary people, those who stand just behind power, those whose names are never recorded, yet who hold the key to a nation's fate. People asked each other, if one man could do the right thing at the exact moment foreign forces bet everything on his weakness, why couldn't others? If loyalty could protect one leader, could it protect an entire continent? If dignity could stand firm against money, could Africa stand firm against the pressures closing in from every direction? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the government began to notice something unprecedented. The people were no longer waiting for the leader alone. They began to see their own role in the fight for sovereignty. They understood that if one man could stand firm in the shadows, then every person could protect their nation through small daily choices. In schools, teachers told the story as a new moral lesson, that a nation is not built only from victories or resources. It is built from the moments when people refuse to sell themselves. In military camps, young officers gathered their soldiers and spoke about discipline not as an obligation, but as part of a promise to the nation. They said that an army cannot win without loyalty, and loyalty cannot survive unless every soldier asks himself what side he truly stands on. In government meetings, sovereignty was no longer discussed only as a political statement, but as a living value. They had seen that if the sovereignty of one leader could be defended in the sacred moment of prayer, then the sovereignty of an entire nation could be defended if loyalty was preserved within every layer of society. The story of Burkina Faso placed before Africa a question that can no longer be avoided. Has the era in which the continent was controlled from its own internal cracks finally come to an end? Was the moment the bodyguard said no a signal of something far larger beginning to unfold? That is the question the next part will take us closer to, not through theory, but through the very path Burkina Faso is now opening for the entire continent. There are moments when a story no longer belongs to the one who tells it. It steps out on its own, spreads on its own, grows on its own, until it becomes part of a nation's collective memory. And the story of the bodyguard in Burkina Faso has reached such a moment. It is no longer the story of a failed plot or a lesson about loyalty. It has become a mirror reflecting a far greater truth. The future of a nation is not shaped by those with the most power, but by the people who choose to stand firm when everything is most fragile. Burkina Faso, from the outside, looks like a young nation facing layers of international, regional, and internal pressure. But look deeper, and something far more important appears. The country is entering a period in which every citizen feels connected to the same thread of destiny. A period in which loyalty is no longer a slogan on a wall, but a real decision made by ordinary people. When the government learned of the $5 million plot, they did not launch massive arrests, did not issue big declarations to prove strength or purity. They let the story find its own path because they understood that its power lay in being carried by trust, not by orders. And that trust is now shaping Burkina Faso's future. Young soldiers began seeing the bodyguard's moment of refusal as a new standard to live by. They understood that a country stands firm only when those closest to the leader choose justice over personal gain. Soldiers who once treated their duties as routine now felt like shields guarding the soul of the nation. In families, parents were told the story as a way to teach children that a person's value is not measured by the money the world places on them, but by what they refuse to trade away. A mother in Farinagoma said on the radio that she had never felt such strong faith in her country's future. She said if one man could say no to $5 million, then an entire people could say no to injustice, oppression, and foreign interference. In the capital, a high school teacher told students the story would appear in lessons on civic ethics. Because history does not always give us such vivid examples, real people proving that dignity can defeat ambition. And in rural areas, where people once felt excluded from the nation's big stories, they now understood that a single right decision could change the path of the entire country. They no longer saw themselves as spectators, they saw themselves as part of a movement resisting dependency. A new portrait of Burkina Faso slowly emerged. A nation not strong because it has no enemies, but strong because it has rediscovered the shield that protects it from within. A nation not strong because its leader faces no threat, but because the people standing closest to him choose to stand on the side of what is right. At this moment, the question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can stand firm. The question is whether Burkina Faso can lead. Lead a continent trying to break free from centuries of dependency. Lead a generation beginning to understand that the future is not something gifted, it is something protected day by day through tense, quiet, dignified decisions. And if you've been following this story, if you feel even a spark of pride, a spark of hope, or simply respect for the choice of a man who stood silently behind his leader, I want to invite you to do something. Leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel, not just to support this content, but because together we are keeping the flame alive for stories of dignity, sovereignty, and loyalty. Because stories like this only stay powerful if they are not forgotten. And only when they are retold can they become the fuel for a different future.